The wind howled through the steel canyons of downtown Boston, cutting through layers of wool and cashmere as if they were nothing more than paper. For Helen Anderson, standing on the balcony of the penthouse that had been her home for 40 years, the cold was fitting. It matched the chill that had settled in her heart since her husband, Donald Taylor, passed away 3 years ago. Inside, the warmth of the fireplace and the clinking of crystal glasses offered no comfort. It was her 62nd birthday, a milestone that should have been celebrated with love, yet the room was filled with sharks circling the water. At the center of the predatory school was Justin Baker, her stepson. He was a man of 38, who wore Italian suits that cost more than most people's cars. Yet, he possessed a soul as cheap as a plastic trinket. He was currently holding court by the bar, laughing loudly with 3 members of the Taylor Enterprises board, his eyes occasionally darting toward Helen with a look that was less filial affection and more calculated assessment. Helen adjusted the pearl necklace at her throat, feeling the weight of the moment. Tonight wasn't just a party, it was an ambush. Earlier that afternoon, Justin had presented her with legal papers, masked, as a birthday gift. They were power of attorney documents, essentially declaring her mentally incompetent to manage the Taylor estate or her own finances. He had cited her recent forgetfulness, a few missed appointments, and a lost set of keys as evidence of early onset dementia. It was a lie, a cruel fabrication designed to seize control of the family empire before the fiscal year ended. "It's for your own good, Helen," he had said, his voice dripping with faux concern. "You need rest. The nursing facility in Vermont is beautiful this time of year." The ultimatum was clear: sign the papers voluntarily and go to the home. Or he would drag her through a humiliating public court battle where he would pay doctors to testify against her sanity. Unable to breathe the suffocating air of the party any longer, Helen slipped out the service entrance. She grabbed a heavy coat from the rack, not caring that it belonged to the caterer, and took the elevator down to the alleyway. She needed air. She needed to think. She walked aimlessly for blocks, her expensive heels clicking unevenly on the cracked pavement. The city changed quickly here. The pristine sidewalks of Beacon Hill gave way to the shadowed, gritty underbelly of the warehouse district. She didn't realize how far she had walked until the streetlights flickered out, leaving her in That was when she heard the footsteps. 2 men emerged from the shadows of a loading dock, their faces obscured by hoods, their intentions unmistakably malicious. Helen froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Nice pearls, lady," one of them sneered, stepping closer. Helen backed up, her back hitting a cold brick wall. "Please," she stammered, her voice trembling not from the cold but from sheer terror. "Take the jewelry." The first man laughed, a harsh, grating sound, and reached for her arm. But before his fingers could graze her coat, a massive shape erupted from a pile of cardboard boxers nearby. It was a blur of motion, violent and precise. A figure slammed into the attacker, tackling him to the wet pavement with the force of a freight train. The second attacker lunged, pulling a knife, but the mysterious protector was faster. He kicked the knife away with a heavy boot and delivered a thunderous right hook that sent the man sprawling into the trash cans. The fight was over in 10 seconds. The attackers, realizing they had picked the wrong fight, scrambled to their feet and sprinted into the darkness. Helen slid down the wall, clutching her chest, gasping for air. Her savior stood over her, breathing heavily. He was a mountain of a man, perhaps in his early 60s, with a thick, graying beard and hair that hadn't seen a barber in months. His clothes were layers of tattered flannel and an oversized, stained army jacket. But it was his hands that caught her attention as he reached out to help her up. They were scarred, the skin mottled with old burns. His voice was rough, like gravel grinding together, but surprisingly gentle. Helen looked up into his eyes. They were a piercing, intelligent blue, framed by crow's feet and grime. There was a depth to them, a profound sadness that seemed to mirror her own. I don't think so," she whispered, taking his hand. His grip was firm and warm. "Just taking out the trash," the man grunted, releasing her hand quickly, as if ashamed of his touch. He turned to gather the cardboard boxers he had been using for shelter. "You shouldn't be here." Helen watched him. He moved with a stiff grace, favoring his left leg. He looked like a man the world had thrown away, yet he carried himself with an authority that didn't match his station. She asked, stepping away from the wall. He paused, looking back at her over his shoulder. "Michael," he said. Helen looked at just Michael, and then she thought of the penthouse, the sharks, and Justin. An insane, desperate idea began to form in her mind. Justin wanted to prove she was incompetent, a lonely widow who couldn't manage her life. But the terms of her late husband's trust had a clause. her spouse would automatically gain a seat on the board in joint conservatorship, blocking any unilateral action by a child. Michael, Helen said, her voice gaining a sudden steel strength she hadn't felt in years. I have a proposition for you. A job, it pays. Michael turned fully, eyeing her with suspicion. I'm not a hitman, lady. Helen stepped closer, ignoring the smell of wood smoke and old rain that clung to him. I don't need a hitman. Michael stared at her, then let out a dry chuckle. But Helen didn't waver. My stepson is trying to steal my life. He thinks I'm weak. He thinks I'm alone? If I return to that party tonight with a fiancé, it halts his legal proceedings. She looked at his scarred hands. You were a firefighter, weren't you? The burns on your hands. Michael looked at his hands, his expression darkening. A long time ago. Helen nodded. You saved me tonight. Save me one more time. Come with me. Pretend to be my fiancé for 3 months. I'll give you a warm bed, food, and $50,000 when it's done. Michael looked at the desperate woman in the expensive coat. He had been living in the shadows for 5 years, punishing himself for the one fire he couldn't put out, the one that took everything from him. He had sworn off societally, sworn off caring, but looking at Helen, he saw the same flickering flame of a survivor that he felt inside himself. And, truthfully, the winter was getting harder to survive every year. He asked quietly. The best, she promised. Michael sighed, a puff of white mist in the freezing air. All right, lady. 2 hours later, the atmosphere in the penthouse had shifted from bored indulgence to shocked silence. The music had stopped. Justin stood near the fireplace, his glass of scotch frozen halfway to his mouth. Helen had returned, but she wasn't the trembling, defeated woman who had left. She stood tall in the doorway, her head high, and on her arm was a man who, despite the hastily bought suit from a 24-hour superstore that fit a bit too loosely in the shoulders, radiated a terrifying masculinity. He had shaved the beard, revealing a strong, square jawline and a jagged scar running from his ear to his chin. He looked rough, dangerous, and utterly out of place among the social. Everyone, Helen announced, her voice ringing clear as a bell. I have an announcement. I would like to introduce you to Michael Smith. Justin dropped his glass. It shattered on the marble hearth, the sound echoing like a gunshot. He sputtered, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. Helen, have you lost your mind? Who is this ... This brute? Justin marched over, getting right in Michael's face. Michael didn't blink. He towered over the younger man, his blue eyes icy cold. I suggest you watch your tone with my future wife, Michael said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the chests of everyone nearby. The threat was palpable. Justin took a step back, sensing a violence he wasn't equipped to handle. He sneered at Helen. This is a farce. I'll have this annulled by morning. You're proving my point. Helen, check the trust, Justin, Helen said coldly. Clause for as of this engagement, my assets are frozen to outside transfers until the wedding. Justin looked at Michael, then Achielling, his eyes narrowing with pure venom. Enjoy your pet, Helen, he hissed. The first week of their arrangement was a study in contrasts, a friction between two worlds colliding in the silent velvet-draped halls of the penthouse. Michael was a ghost haunting a palace. Helen would often find him not in the guest suite with its Egyptian cotton sheets and view of the Charles River, but sleeping on the rug in the library, his back pressed against the solid oak of the bookshelves. He claimed the mattress was too soft, that it felt like sinking into quicksand. But Helen suspected it was simply that luxury felt like a trap to a man who had spent years surviving on the edge. She began to see the man beneath the grime she had washed away. He was disciplined, waking before dawn to do calisthenics on the terrace, his scarred body moving with a rigid, military precision. He fixed the leaky faucet in the kitchen that 3 plumbers had failed to repair, and he reorganized her chaotic pantry with an efficiency that bordered on obsessive. But it was the silence that defined him. He spoke only when necessary, his words measured and clipped, shielding his past like a fortress. Yet, there were cracks in the armor. Juan, evening. While Helen struggled to decipher a complex quarterly financial report from Taylor Enterprises, a report Justin had intentionally obfuscated with jargon to confuse her, Michael walked by, glanced at the papers spread on the mahogany table, and paused. "The debt-to-equity ratio in column 4 is wrong," he murmured, almost to himself. "They are hiding a liquid asset transfer under operational costs." Before Helen could ask how a homeless ex-firefighter knew how to read a corporate balance sheet, Hijad turned and walked away, the heavy limp in his left leg the only sound in the room. The tension with Justin, however, was not silent. It was a screaming siren that never turned off. Her stepson had not taken the engagement lightly. He had launched a private investigation into Mikhail Smith, digging for dirt, for a criminal record, for anything that would void the trust's protection or send Michael back to the streets. Every interaction was a skirmish. Justin would drop by unannounced, bringing lawyers or business associates, trying to catch Michael off guard, to expose him as an uneducated brute. He invited them to the annual Taylor Charity Gala, the highlight of Boston's social season, with a gleam in his eye that promised humiliation. "Bring your Symphions, Helen," Justin had sneered, tossing the gilded invitation onto the coffee table. "Let's see how he handles the salad fork." Helen wanted to refuse to protect Michael from the wolves, but Michael had picked up the invitation, his calloused thumb brushing the embossed lettering. "We'll go," he said, his voice flat. "He wants a show." The night of the gala, the ballroom of the Fairmont Copley Plaza was a sea of black ties and designer gowns, a glittering aquarium of wealth and pretense. Helen wore a sapphire gown that matched her eyes, but she felt fragile, her hand gripping Michael's arm tightly. Michael had been transformed. The tuxedo she had bought him was tailored to perfection, hiding the bulk of his muscles and the scars of his past. He looked distinguished, almost regal, with his silver hair combed back and his beard trimmed close. But Helen could feel the tension radiating off him, his muscles coiled tight as a spring. As they entered, the room went quiet, whispers rippling through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Justin was holding court near the orchestra, a champagne flute in hand, looking like the cat that had cornered the canary. He waited until they were in the center of the room, surrounded by the board of directors and the city's elite, before striking. He clapped his hands, stopping the music. "Ladies and gentlemen," Justin announced, his voice booming, "a toast to my stepmother, the lovely Helen, and her new da-da-da companion. It's truly a Cinderella story, isn't it? Just last week, Mr. Smith here was fighting rats for a sandwich in an alley behind my office." A gasp went through the room. Snickers broke out. Justin gestured to a large screen behind the stage, where a grainy security photo appeared Michael, dirty, bearded, and huddled under a bridge. "Tell us," Justin mocked, stepping closer, invading his personal space. "What's your favorite vintage?" Helen felt tears of shame pricking her eyes, not for herself, but for Michael. She opened her mouth to defend him, to scream at Justin, but Michael squeezed her hand gently and stepped forward. He didn't look at the screen. He looked straight at Justin, his blue eyes burning with a cold, terrifying intensity that silenced the room. "I've drunk rainwater to survive." "Yes," Michael said, his voice carrying to the back of the hall without a microphone. "And Ivy pulled men like you out of burning buildings while you screamed for your mothers. Poverty is a circumstance. Justin, cruelty is a choice." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Justin's face turned purple, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. He had expected a bumbling fool. He had gotten a warrior, but the confrontation was cut short by a sudden, ear-splitting boom from the kitchen. The floor shook, and the lights flickered and died. A moment later, thick, black smoke began to pour from the service doors, followed by the terrifying orange glow of an uncontrolled grease fire. Panic, instant and primal, seized the crowd. The elite of Boston, so composed seconds ago, turned into a stampede of screaming animals. Pale ply-shaved, trampled, and clawed over each other to get to the exits, which were quickly bottle-necked. Justin, the man who had mocked Michael's courage, was the first to shove an elderly woman aside, scrambling over a table to get away from the smoke. Helen froze, the terror paralyzing her, the smoke sting in her eyes. She felt herself being jostled, about to fall, when strong hands grabbed her shoulders. It was Michael, but the man in the tuxedo was gone. The firefighter had returned. Michael roared, his voice cutting through the screams. He ripped the tablecloth off a nearby table, dipped it into an ice bucket, and wrapped the wet cloth around Helen's face. The vents are pulling the smoke down. He didn't run. He moved with a terrifying calm, grabbing panicked guests and shoving them towards safety, shouting orders that people instinctively obeyed. He saw Justin cowering under a table, paralyzed by fear as a decorative drape caught fire above him. Michael didn't hesitate. He lunged through the smoke, tackling Justin and rolling him to safety just as the burning fabric collapsed where he had been standing. Michael dragged the coughing, weeping man to the emergency exit and threw him out into the cool night air. For the next 20 minutes, until the sirens wailed in the distance, Michael was a machine of salvation, entering the smoke repeatedly, guiding the lost, calming the hysterical. When the real firefighters finally burst in, they found Michael carrying a waitress who had twisted her ankle, his tuxedo ruined, his face blackened with soot, but his eyes clear and focused. One of the fire captains, a grizzly veteran, stopped as he saw Michael. He squinted through the smoke, a look of shock crossing his face. The captain whispered, "Chief Brown?" Michael turned away quickly, shaking his head, and melted back into the crowd, grabbing Helen's hand and pulling her into the night. Back at the penthouse, the adrenaline crashed. Michael sat on the edge of the sofa, his hands shaking uncontrollably. It wasn't the cold, it was the memories. The smell of the smoke had unlocked the vault he kept sealed in his mind. Helen sat beside him, ignoring the soot staining her expensive furniture, and took his scarred hands in hers. "They called you Chief," she whispered. Michael looked at her, his defenses shattered by the fire. Tears cut tracks through the soot on his face. "I wasn't just a firefighter," he choked out. "I was a captain. I commanded a station in Chicago 5 years ago. My house caught fire, electrical fault. I was on shift." His voice broke, a sound of pure agony. "I saved strangers every day, but I couldn't save my wife, Patricia. I couldn't save my little girl, Melissa. I pulled them out, but it was too late. I quit. I walked away. I couldn't be that man anymore. I couldn't be rich. I couldn't be successful. I couldn't be happy." Helen wept with him, holding the broken hero in her arms. She told him of her own grief, the silence of the house after Donald died, the feeling of being useless, of being erased by age and erased. In that shared vulnerability, the contract between them dissolved. They were no longer employer and employee. They were two survivors clinging to each other in a shipwreck. "You're not useless," Helen said fiercely, touching his cheek. "You saved me. You saved Justin, even though he didn't deserve it." Michael looked at her, and for the first time in 5 years, the ice in his blue eyes began to thaw. He leaned in, and their foreheads touched, a gesture of intimacy that transcended romance. It was a pact of survival, but the peace was fragile. The next morning, Justin arrived at the penthouse not with an apology, but with the police. He was bruised, his arm in a sling, but his eyes were manic with triumph. He had been humiliated, saved by his enemy, and his ego couldn't handle the debt. He had dug deeper, past the homeless shelters, past the fire records, and he had found something else, or thought he had. Justin shouted, pointing a finger at Michael, who was drinking coffee in the kitchen. "Officer, arrest him. I found the discrepancy in the accounts. He didn't just fix the boiler. He accessed my father's private safe." Justin held up a plastic bag containing a Pon Taquita plant, obvious and crude, but effective. Two officers stepped forward, hands on their holsters. The officer asked, "We have a warrant for your arrest for grand larceny and fraud, and we also have a report from Chicago about a missing person case that matches your description." Michael stood up slowly, his eyes locking with Helen's. He didn't fight. He knew the system. He knew how easy it was to crush a man with no name. "It's a lie, Helen," he said, calmly as they cuffed him. "Do not sign anything Justin gives you." As they dragged him out, Justin leaned in close to Helen, whispering, "Game over, stepmother." The holding cell smelled of bleach and despair. Michael sat on the narrow metal cot, his eyes closed, listening to the rhythmic dripping of a pipe somewhere in the concrete walls. He wasn't thinking about the charges grand larceny and fraud were serious, but they were legal fictions, easily dismantled with the right phone call. He was thinking about Helen. He was thinking about the look of absolute terror in her eyes when the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. For 5 years, Michael had punished himself with poverty, believing that his failure to save his family meant he deserved nothing. But seeing Justin Baker smirk while destroying a good woman had ignited a spark in the wet ashes of his soul. He had walked away from his life, his name, and his empire because he didn't care about himself. But now, he cared about her. Smith. Lawyers here, the guard barked, rattling the bars. Michael stood up, expecting the court-appointed public defender. Instead, a man in a charcoal three-piece suit stood on the other side of the interrogation table. He was elderly, with silver hair and a posture that screamed Ivy League old money. He looked at Michael dirty, exhausted, wearing an orange jumpsuit hand, his eyes filled with tears. "Mr. Brown," the lawyer whispered, his voice trembling. "My God, we thought you were dead." The board ... the shareholders ... Michael sat down heavily. "Hello, Paul Martin." The chief legal counsel for Brown Dynamics, one of the largest defense and safety technology conglomerates in the world, shook his head in disbelief. "I never gave up looking, Michael. I knew a fire couldn't kill you. But ... why? Why this? You have billions sitting in trust. I didn't want the money, Paul. I couldn't save them with money," Michael said, his voice rough. "But now I need it. Not for me. For a woman who is about to lose everything to a vulture. I need you to get me out of here." Michael's eyes hardened, the blue ice returning, but this time with the calculated precision of the CEO he used to be. The debt, all of it. By the mortgage on the Taylor building, by the credit lines for Taylor Enterprises. The following morning, the mood in the Taylor Enterprises boardroom was funereal for everyone except Justin. He sat at the head of the long obsidian table, spinning a pen between his fingers. Helen sat at the far end, looking small and defeated. She had not slept. The press was already running stories about her criminal lover, and the board was in a panic. Justin had called an emergency vote of no confidence to remove Helen as the honorary chairwoman and stripper of her veto powers. "It's really for the best, Helen," Justin said, his voice oozing false sympathy. "You've clearly been manipulated by a con artist. It proves my point about your mental state, bringing a thief into our home. A man who stole from my father's safe. It's tragic." He looked at the board members. Hands began to rise. Slowly, hesitantly, but they rose. Helen closed her eyes, bracing for the impact of the axe. "I object." A deep voice boomed from the entrance. The heavy double door swung open. Justin stood up, furious. Security, who let his voice died in his throat. Michael walked in. He was no longer the homeless man in the tattered jacket, nor was he the uncomfortable fiancé in the ill-fitting tuxedo. He was wearing a bespoke navy suit that cost more than Justin's annual bonus. He was clean-shaven, his hair styled, his posture commanding. Flanking him were Paul Martin and 3 other high-powered attorneys carrying thick leather briefcases.